Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tom Mickelson. I'm the President and Scientific Director of the Ontario Brain Institute, or OBI. So we're a provincially funded, non-for-profit organization that works to accelerate the discovery and innovation benefiting both patients and the economy. OBI is headquartered on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, which is protected and shared under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. So you've joined us today for 3 Lives, Many Stories, the final talk in our 2021-22 Wellness Series, and I'm glad to see so many of you here today. Since 2014, OBI has hosted more than 25 public talks featuring experts from Ontario's neuroscience and brain health community, sharing their knowledge on a wide range of topics. The goal of this whole initiative is to educate, inform, and empower our guests about the impact of brain disorders, as well as advances in brain health. And so far, we've reached over 17,000 people through these talks. The format of tonight's event, though, will be a little bit different from what you might have come to expect. In an effort to better understand the experiences of those living with neurologic conditions, cerebral palsy, Parkinson's, and depression, just to name a few, we've interviewed 3 individuals about their own lived experience with a brain disorder. They're going to be sharing their stories of the diagnosis, the highs and lows they experience, what barriers they face, and how they envision a more inclusive future. OBI has united the Ontario neuroscience community by prioritizing this patient experience, as well as those of their advocates and caregivers, so that better treatments and services can be developed and delivered. The OBI team and our collaborators work hard to put people first. Before we get started, though, I'd like to invite a special guest to offer welcome remarks. The Honourable Jill Dunlop, the Minister of Colleges and Universities of Ontario. Much like one of OBI's core values, it is Minister Dunlop's belief that the creation of partnerships is of utmost importance in order to build successes. And OBI is proud and grateful for our partnership with the Ministry of Colleges and Universities. And so we're pleased that Minister Dunlop is able to participate in tonight's event. So please join me in wishing a warm welcome to Minister Jill Dunlop.
Hello, I'm Jill Dunlop, Ontario's Minister of Colleges and Universities. I'm excited to join you at today's public talk on the personal impacts of brain disorders. I'd like to commend OBI for hosting today's event, as this is a topic we often don't hear enough about, despite the fact that 1 in 3 Ontarians will be impacted by a brain disorder at some point in their lives. Brain disorders are complex. They're often chronic conditions that significantly impact an individual's quality of life and that of their caregivers. Today, we're fortunate to hear from 3 unique individuals who will share their journeys of living with brain disorders. Scientists and clinicians have made many promising advances in the field of neurotechnology over the past few years. This is a true testament to Ontario's world-class research and innovation sector. Our province ranks in the top 5 globally for science productivity and is home to over 800 neuroscientists, one of the highest concentrations of these specialized professionals in the world. While Ontario has outstanding researchers and innovators, the world is changing at an unprecedented rate. That's why research and innovation are so incredibly important, and why we must continue to focus on collaborative thinking and translating research to concrete technologies and treatments that can improve the quality of life for people with brain disorders. Our government values the discoveries made through research in Ontario. That's why from 2018 to 2023, the government is investing $100 million in OBI. With this funding, OBI can maximize the impact of neuroscience and continue to act as a catalyst and integrator between researchers, clinicians, industry, and patients. But most importantly, it can focus on improving the quality and outcomes of research so patients with brain disorders have hope for a better future. Thanks to OBI, the future looks promising. Thank you.
Ten years ago, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. It took about 2 years to get to that formal diagnosis, and it was the start of a very dark chapter in my life. I denied what I had right at the beginning. I pretended I didn't have it. I was blaming too much coffee for my tremors and too much exercise for my uneven gait. So it was a period of time where I lived in denial. I started withdrawing from the world and literally became smaller and smaller in my world until I was living on my couch. I mean, I was negating my friends. I wasn't going into the office. And when I was in the office, I buried myself in my office until I reached that point of acceptance. And that point came 2 years when I was alone on a Saturday night when my family had left me. I didn't want to socialize with anybody. And I literally burst out crying and became angry with myself. So I definitely went through 5 emotions in about 2 hours. But at some point, I became exhausted and had clarity of thought. And I remember the day, that was the day that I accepted Parkinson's in my life. Up to that point, I was living in denial. And then that day and that night, I started realizing that I still had a life to live. I still had a good job, father and a spouse, and providing for my family. So I literally took control. I got off my couch and got onto my treadmill that I hadn't been on for 2 years before and started walking. And the more I did that, the better I felt over weeks and months. Over the next 3 years, I completed 3 half marathons. For my tremor, I returned to my love for drumming, and that was a high as well. So my day could start on a low when I wake up in the morning and stiff and can't move. I then take my medication an hour later and then I'm moving. So even within a small span of time, there are highs and lows. One of my roads that I'm on is to educate employers about Parkinson's, of course, because there are a lot of invisible symptoms that I carry on a daily basis. I mean, the giveaways are obviously the tremors and shakes. People can see that. But as a lawyer, that impacted my career because a client doesn't want to see, tremors and shakes. So it's that whole issue of stigma about disclosure, about the impact of disclosure. We can still do a job. We just need to be accommodated. And when I had that discussion with EY about their neurodiversity centers of excellence, I think they're doing a tremendous job on that. Because I think of all of us as not disabled, but of being differently abled, and I think that is advocacy and that is education. So that's one of the things that I'm still, involved with. My life after Parkinson's has become more rewarding and fulfilling because it's given me the opportunity to focus my life, to focus on what my purpose in life is. I say to people now when I have the opportunities, don't wait for a diagnosis. Live your life like you have received a diagnosis, because that for me gave me focus and gives me focus on a day-to-day basis.
So it's probably been over 20 years now when I was actually first sort of diagnosed with depression. In my first job, I practiced as a pharmacist at Sick Kids. And then from there, I moved into the pharmaceutical industry. I was working so hard and I wasn't sleeping very well. I was feeling very anxious about things, and my mood was really low. There was a point where I wasn't even, my friends were checking up on me, and I wasn't even answering the phone. And I just didn't want to talk about it. And it took me quite a long time. And I knew that they were definitely depression symptoms, based on my background. My doctor had suggested me to go to a peer support group. And my family and friends thought, that might be really helpful. But I thought, I don't really want to go there and talk about my feelings. But I promised everyone in and also with my family doctor, he said, it might be kind of really helpful for you to be with others that are going through the same thing. So when I finally went to actually Hope and Me, I found it on the website. It was an evening depression group. And so I tried to get into the office, and I was thinking, oh, I really, really don't want to go. I was trying to get into the door, but the door was locked. So I thought, okay, I'm not going because I can't get in. But then someone was walking out and opened up the door for me, and I thought, oh goodness. So I finally actually went in to the first group. It was like pretty jam-packed. And I didn't say a word the very first time, but as I'm hearing what everyone is kind of talking about, I can like so much relate to them, and I kept on going. I ended up volunteering and then ended up working at Hope and Me. And what I've kind of learned over all these years is that many people are able to sort of live very well and for sort of fulfilling lives with different types of mood disorders and brain disorders. And I think that's kind of really important for the public to realize. And it also has given me sort of a new appreciation for life. I feel that a lot of folks that have gone through this are more compassionate and are more empathetic for a lot of people that have gone through similar kind of challenges. And I really hope that this series will definitely help people remember that you are not your illness. So, and basically, like whether you live with a mood or a brain disorder, you can actually be strength. There can be a lot of strength in that in many ways.
My name is Amanda St. Dennis. I am diagnosed with mild to moderate right side hemiplegic spastic cerebral palsy. I also live with ADHD. Highly likely I'm also autistic, and I live with anxiety. I also worked 10 summers at East Seals, Ontario, Camp Marywood. Part of my journey has been helping kids realize that they can do the littlest things. I've watched someone get into a kayak for the first time all by themselves and paddle away. I've watched someone put on a sock for the very first time. So it's not only magical because it's outside, it's camp, camp's awesome, but it's magical because it's a place of firsts. It's a place of celebration of the little things. It's a place for celebrating the differences in each and every one of us and what each of us can bring. And so Easter Seals is a huge portion of who I am. I horseback ride. Horses will meet you where you're at, and they'll respond to your energy. And there are therapeutic riding centers throughout Canada. There's one just outside of Ottawa who take on children and adults with disabilities, but I don't ride there. I actually ride at a barn in outskirts of Ottawa that is fully used to teaching non-disabled riders how to ride. And I explain to them my difficulties. I explain to them my limitations. I'm not minimized in any way. I'm not seen as less. I'm not seen as different. I'm seen as a rider. I'm seen as a rider who can contribute to barn chores and barn life. That's inclusion. That's seeing, okay, so this is different, but sure, let's give it a go. Let's give it a try. And I've been riding at that barn for 3 years now. And to me, that's what inclusion is. That is meeting people where they are. It is valuing each and every one of us for what we can bring to the table, what we can bring to a job, because you want to and because you can, not because you have to.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda LeDuc, and it is my huge pleasure to welcome you all to our OBI Public Talk, 3 Lives, Many Stories. We're so glad to have you this evening for our last talk in this wellness series, focusing on 3 incredible individuals and their stories firsthand of living with a brain disorder. We do have about 40 minutes to chat live with our panelists, so we will take as many questions as we can in that limited amount of time. To send us your questions, you can use the chat function on the right side of your screen, or you can DM our Twitter account, which is @OntarioBrain, or you can email us at communications@braininstitute.ca. And that information will pop up at several points over the course of tonight's discussion. So you'll be able to get those prompts to send in your questions, and we look forward to receiving them. Before we begin the discussion, I did want to take note of just one more thing, and that's a note around language. You'll notice over the course of the presentation and the discussion that several different kinds of language are used and different ways of identifying are talked about. Some of us in this conversation use what is known as person-first language. The construction of this is person with a disability. Some of us use the identity-first construction, and the idea there is that someone is a disabled person. The idea, similarly, some of us refer to conditions that we have, whereas others of us speak of the diseases that impact our lives. And we want to acknowledge and celebrate the fact that we all come to these respective journeys with different perspectives and different viewpoints, and that part of what makes these journeys so special is the fact that we do have different choices to use different kinds of language to empower ourselves. And what really ultimately makes all of this special is the way that we give ourselves and each other grace as we go through these different journeys. And with that, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome our panelists tonight. Amanda St. Dennis works with CanChild as a member of CPNet's Stakeholder Advisory Committee and its Transition Hub, and is also a co-investigator in a research study about the barriers to research partnership for youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities. Welcome, Amanda. Andrew Kcomt is a knowledge translation and research manager at Hope and Me, the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario. He is also the co-chair of the Can-Bind Community Advisory Committee, or CAC, where he represents the community and lived experience perspective on the Ontario Brain Institute's knowledge translation, outreach, and communications team. And Larry Linton is the chair of Parkinson Canada's Patient Advisory Council, PAC, and member of the ONDRI Patient and Community Advisory Committee. After his Parkinson's diagnosis in 2012, Larry facilitated the development of the PAC to help ensure the voice of Canadians with Parkinson's disease are present in all programming decisions, and to also help formalize the design of a Parkinson-centered organization. He is also the author of Shaken, Not Stirred, Living with Parkinson's Disease, a First-Hand Perspective on Life with Parkinson's. So welcome to all 3 of you. To start off the discussion tonight, Larry, I'd like to begin with you. In your wonderful presentation a little bit earlier tonight, I heard you say that you really are advocating for people to live their lives like they have a diagnosis. And I wonder if you could concretely just tell us a little bit more about what that looks like.
Well, thank you, Amanda. There's nothing quite like being diagnosed with a chronic, progressive, and incurable illness to force you to focus on your life. But I am here to tell you and the audience, obviously, that diagnosis may not be the beginning of the end. It could be, in fact, the start of a more rewarding, fulfilling chapter in your life. In my case, the day of diagnosis brought some relief because I finally knew what I had, but that day was the start of a very dark chapter. And it took about 2 years after that diagnosis, when I went through all the other stages of grief to the point of acceptance, that I could start living my life when I chose to live with Parkinson's and no longer against it. I decided to reinvent myself and had the opportunity to regain and reclaim a life that was worth living once again. So when I say that you should live like you've just received bad news, what I mean really is live with intent, live with meaning. Don't ruminate on things that have happened in the past, and don't fixate on the future. You can live mindfully in the present. And so that's what I encourage everybody to do, is live with intent.
Mm, that's wonderful. Thank you. I think part of what strikes me so much about that focus of living with intent is, you mentioned as well how advocating for unmet needs, and for you acknowledging unmet needs in the workplace in particular, was a huge part, an intrinsic part of your journey. And I wonder, how does this advocacy change, or how did it change for you once you made that shift to acknowledging your diagnosis and embracing it into your life? What did that living with intent really start to mean?
Well, at first I thought that I was the only one diagnosed at 49 with Parkinson's, and it brought an extra level of burden and stress to me. I was mid-career, married with a mortgage, 2 teenage kids, and I faced those extra emotional burdens myself. But the more I engage with the Parkinson community, I've realized that these unmet needs are felt by everybody. And I then engage further in the community and realize that it's also felt across diseases and other people, and even affects caregivers. So it brought me onto this journey of advocacy, to educate, to advocate, and even on the other spectrum, looking at neurodiverse individuals in the workplace, because these are the concerns and questions that we're all faced with. My biggest challenge was, was I going to lose my job? Should I disclose? What would the impact be on disclosure? Could I still work? Would I lose the house? And on the other hand, when it comes to neurodiverse individuals, they tend to be unemployed or underemployed. And I think there needs to be, and there have been great strides made to educating employers on the invisible nature of chronic illnesses. A lot of the motor symptoms of Parkinson's are visible, but the majority are non-visible. And it really depends on how people perceive you in the workplace. And there's a great need to advise, advocate, and educate people about chronic illnesses, because we are still valuable. We still have a contribution to make, but we need the right type of accommodation.
That's great. And I think it's such a wonderful point, because it brings up a point that really we'll come back to again and again in this discussion, where really acknowledging illness, acknowledging conditions is part of acknowledging community and the responsibilities that we all have toward one another. And I'd like to, on that note, move to Andrew for my next question. Andrew, you had such a beautiful way of talking about community when you talked about in your video about the door being locked, and then having someone else open it for you and essentially welcome you in is what happened, and that started you on your own journey. And one of the things that I found really powerful that you talked about was language, and your use of language, and acknowledging and mentioning that you are not your illness. Could you expand on that phrase a little bit and talk a little bit more about what that means to you?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for that, Amanda. And I can actually very much relate to what Larry had mentioned before. So basically, like living with a mood disorder like depression, it can often be seen as more of like an invisible barrier that others can not often kind of see. And there can actually be a really negative impact when you actually are disclosing that. And actually, because of all of that kind of stigma, a lot of like mood disorders often go diagnosed and kind of undertreated. There's often a lack of funding and a lot of difficulty in accessing care. So I think I want everyone to kind of realize that it's really important to sort of recognize, especially with those invisible kind of barriers and things like living with mental illness, that there's still lots of strengths and abilities that can help you sort of move forward and have a really kind of good life and sort of be able to sort of achieve your goals and focus a lot on things that matter most for you.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of sort of shame around living with different types of brain disorders and also around in the mental illness area. But there's nothing to be kind of ashamed about. Mental illness kind of affects either yourself or a loved one or a neighbor. It affects like everyone. So having mental illness is like similar to like having a physical illness. So if you're starting to kind of get older, like I am, and I'm getting carpal tunnel syndrome or something, it's easy for me to kind of go to my doctor to talk about that. But oftentimes there's those like barriers around opening up about talking about mental health challenges. And it's important to let people know that there are lots of really great treatments out there, and you can continue to live a very sort of good and fulfilling life. I also want
Mm.
people to sort of realize that, despite having that kind of like diagnosis, you can often I've kind of learned over all of these years that it's given me more of an appreciation for everything that's kind of going on in my life, especially when I'm getting older, and sort of hearing people kind of go through like the similar challenges that I went through years ago. And you become much more empathetic and compassionate to everyone kind of struggling with different types of brain disorders and going through all those similar challenges. So I guess my big hope for anyone kind of listening is to remember that you're not just your illness, and living with a brain disorder can be a big strength in many ways.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, it really can. And thank you for saying that, because that leads right into my next question. Um, I mean, it is a big strength, and it, in many ways, I think can help to foster and contribute to the resilience that we feel as individuals as we go through things. And what are some ways that for you, that you found that resilience can be fostered after you've received a diagnosis?
Yeah, we actually in our workplace we talk quite a bit about resilience, and sort of despite many of the challenges a lot of people have gone through after they've been sort of diagnosed. You can kind of sort of look back and see in like many ways how it's impacted you in a lot of positive ways. So focusing on sort of building resilience is not just like a one-time kind of event. It's more of kind of an ongoing like process. And it's more kind of like going through like a journey. We can
Mhm.
sort of like both learn and share those strengths and share those kind of strategies so that we can all sort of live a good quality, have a good quality life. So when you have resilience, you can sort of harness that kind of inner strength that we all have inside of us. And it can help you sort of rebound from any setbacks or challenges. You can kind of learn from that. And so while resilience doesn't necessarily make all the problems go away, resilience can help you kind of see the past and then sort of learn from that and sort of find all of the little things that you can kind of enjoy in life and kind of handle kind of stress in a lot in like better ways. And it's also sort of provided me with sort of more of an ability to be more adaptive to sort of difficult situations, like kind of going through the pandemic and all of the challenges that everyone has kind of gone through, and sort of be able to sort of be able to kind of reach out to others and kind of get that support, which is really a key part to becoming resilient. And I think
Mhm.
change is sort of like an inevitable sort of part of life, and many of those aspects of changing can sometimes be outside our individual control. But it's important to sort of acknowledge that, pushing against things outside of your control will only sort of drain your energy. So I think it's sort of important to sort of accept kind of what you're kind of going through by sort of allowing yourself to kind of feel your emotions, so that even when you have those like very sort of intense, upsetting feelings, just know that they will pass. Like, I remember sort of living out in Vancouver, and even with the weather, it can be similar with your life, right? Sometimes the weather can be like, very calm, and then slowly, it can become like really bad weather. And sometimes it can happen suddenly. But it's kind of important that, the weather will eventually get better. And just like a lot of the challenges that you go through in life, things will eventually pass. And then what you can actually do is sort of free that up and sort of devote your energy through resilience, so that you can sort of take more control and invest yourself in things like self-care that you feel is kind of really important, because we all kind of deserve a really good quality of life.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's, those are, I think, key points for anybody, regardless of where you're coming at challenges from, dealing with things by reaching out to community and getting help and finding ways to foster your own resilience, I think are important lessons for all of us. Amanda, I have a question for you now. In your video, again, we come back to the theme of community. You talk about the importance of meeting people where they are, much like Larry's, points about meeting unmet needs, and then Andrew's points about community as well. What does this mean for you in terms of inclusivity and accommodation toward disabilities and conditions and things like that?
Thank you so much, Amanda, for the question. For me, when thinking about accommodation and inclusion, I think of not thinking of accommodation as a burden, not thinking of accommodation as just for disability. We all have needs met and unmet, and to be part of a community and a community that works well together, we always think that the best way to do it is to use each other's strengths and then use our strengths to subsidize our weaknesses. Yet when we talk disability and we talk accommodations, often people like to make excuses as to why they can't accommodate, or why someone's disability does not make them a good candidate for a job, for example, or it's too much of a burden to accommodate in a recreation situation. So instead of looking at accommodation as something that's just for those with disabilities or just those with disorders, think of it as accommodating everybody, because a simple accommodation can be something for everybody. For example, curb cuts in sidewalks. Wheelchair users can go get down curbs much easier, but so can mothers pushing strollers, or people who have difficulty walking, even older dogs that you're walking. So there's many reasons for a curb cut that have now all of a sudden not necessarily have a connection to disability automatically.
Mm-hmm. I think, again, right, we come back to that point of it really is a community issue, and we are stronger as a community when we look at these issues together. I think the point that you made about the equestrian club is a really great one there, because you talked about how you ride at a club and they meet you where you are, and they just sort of understand that that is a need that you have, and it's their responsibility to meet it in order to make that experience as inclusive as possible. And in return, you are also an equally contributing member of that community. And I wonder if you could maybe just tell us a little bit more about what that journey has been like for you and how that plays into your own views on how we as, society are responsible for creating good quality of life for all of those around us.
So the barn that I ride at, like I said in the video, is not one that distinctly caters to those with disabilities. It actually caters more so towards the everyday person, usually able-bodied, able-minded, non-disabled. But I walked in one day at an open house and I said, here are things I have issues with. Here are my strengths, here are my weaknesses. And instead of saying, nope, we're not even going to try, they're like, okay, let's try. And we found a pony that worked really, really well with me. And as you've said, I'm a contributing member. I'm actually going to be volunteering this spring. And at first, instead of saying, no, it's too dangerous to volunteer, it's too dangerous, instead the volunteer manager's like, no, you're really good with the horses. You know how to tack up, you know how to groom, you know how to keep people on a schedule. That's your strength. We could really use that on Saturdays. So instead of seeing the things I can't do, many see what my strengths are and utilize them. And I think that would make a better society if we start seeing each other as what we can bring instead of what we take away.
Yeah. Yes, that's absolutely wonderful. I agree 150%. I'm going to take an audience question now. We have quite a few questions coming in. So this is a question for all three of you, and it asks, how can others in society learn more about how best to support someone living with a brain disorder? So maybe we'll go around all three of you, and maybe if you could just pop out one or two resources that come to mind. And I will say that some of these resources will be listed at the end of the talk. So get your pens and pencils ready because you'll be able to write them down for sure. Larry, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. I would say that in my case, it took me about 8 years to get to Parkinson Canada. And because I was going through the trials and tribulations of living with Parkinson's on my own. But if I had my time over, I would certainly have reached out a lot earlier, because Parkinson Canada is a great resource. It should be the resource that is mentioned at your first diagnosis, because they are there to assist you. I remember joining my first support group and having questions answered that took me months and sometimes years to find out myself. And then the support group led to a social group. I joined the Rigid Riders, which is a group of cyclists, and that helped me with the exercise and got me on my bike riding the longest I've ever ridden with Parkinson's. So the first port of call for me is the support groups, is the charities, and I'm hoping that the day of diagnosis you can leave there with a full book of resources that you could utilize to deal with those unmet needs earlier. And when you reach that point of acceptance, it didn't come for me on the day of diagnosis, but certainly on the date of acceptance, I was ready to do that. And those are the resources that I would have turned to.
Thank you. Amanda, how about you? What are some resources that you would recommend?
So other than some of the ones that I've mentioned that will be included, so Cerebral Palsy Ontario, Brain Institute, I'm also going to take a different avenue, and that's look for blogs, social media, Twitter handles that have actually autistic, if you're looking for autistic voices, actually Cerebral CP, actually disabled, if you're looking for disabled voices, individuals at CP, because like this talk is showing, the experts are the ones with lived experience.
So seek us out. A lot of us are not academically published or anything. So blogs, Twitter, Facebook, there's tons of resources. Just ask.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. We live online pretty much. Andrew, do you have any resources that you'd like to recommend people should look at?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I work at Hope and Me, the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario. So we actually offer a lot. We've been around for probably over 36 years. And I think Larry had mentioned the importance of sort of support groups, and especially if you're kind of living through some challenges. All of our programs are free, and I think it's kind of really important to be able to sort of be able to kind of reach out to others, sort of talk about a lot of the things that are kind of going on. So all of our services are free. We also offer group services as well. But I also kind of want to mention like one other really great resource that we kind of developed a couple of years ago. And that's kind of based on our partnership with the Ontario Brain Institute. So they helped us sort of create this really great guide called the Choice D Guide, which is basically based on the latest kind of research on depression. It was kind of written in clear language based on the latest depression research. But what was kind of really unique about it is it was created in partnership with people with lived experience. So basically, the aim of this guide is to sort of raise awareness and sort of provide like an easy to understand, guide about all of your different treatment options and sort of engage in that kind of shared decision making, which I think is kind of really important because sometimes if you're kind of struggling um, with any sort of like brain disorder, it's kind of kind of scary kind of going to your doctor and having them sort of tell you what to do. So it was kind of really important for us to sort of empower people with sort of evidence-based, clear language information so they can kind of know what their treatment options are and be able to sort of partner with their healthcare provider in that kind of shared decision making, which I think is really important. And we're able to provide that in English, French, and Chinese.
Oh, that's wonderful. I have another question for all three of you. You're all deeply involved in community and advocacy work, and you've each talked a lot about what that advocacy means to you. What does inclusion and accommodation look like in the future for you? What do you hope to see? Maybe one or two things that you're really kind of keeping your fingers crossed and working towards. Amanda, why don't we start with you?
For me, I want it to not be a hardship, not have to be this thing that I have to stress about. I want it to be something that just happens. The conversation doesn't necessarily have to start from me. It's a huge barrier to a lot that it has to start with me. And I think if we're using workplace as an example, if an employer starts the conversation right there, I already see, oh, you actually value the idea of inclusion. You actually value having diversity. So I'd like to see it just being less of a hurdle and more of a just, okay, this is a conversation or this is something that needs to be done.
And Andrew, what about you? What would you like to see in terms of inclusivity and accommodation in the next few years?
I think that's a really important question to ask. And I think it's, as a lot of folks had kind of mentioned already, it's really important to make sure that everyone kind of feels included. And I think it's really kind of key to understand and sort of identify and address a lot of those sort of underlying assumptions, not just within the public, but oftentimes even within ourselves as we're kind of learning about, different brain disorders. And I think that education piece is very key. Be able to sort of shift those perspectives by sort of acknowledging the gaps that you might have in your personal knowledge And that also includes what you can do is partner with lots of great advocates that are out there and engage in trying to build that knowledge and learn from like one another, and also sort of try to sort of implement that change and not do that just as a one-time thing. Have like, one yearly kind of meeting about inclusivity and accommodations, but it should be something that should be implemented and be something that's sustainable. And it's really important, especially in workplaces, to sort of create a culture of inclusion so that everyone is heard and that you become more comfortable and sort of questioning and challenging some of the norms. And then also making sure that you can kind of focus on that to ensure that the burden of sort of making those changes does not have to kind of rest on those who are often, mostly like marginalized.
Mhm. That is a really, really important point. Larry, what does inclusion and accommodation look like for you?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on what Andrew said and Amanda. For me, the future of accommodation and inclusion in the workplace particularly starts with leadership. It's not the HR department, and it's when these values form part of the company's leadership DNA. I think that's when we can have meaningful discussions about removing the stigma with living with a chronic illness, that it can be openly discussed, where disclosure is not a burden, but a free, open discussion. And with the right type of leadership, those of us could be regarded as differently abled, not disabled, but be warmly welcomed and still have a place to be, and still have a contribution to make and be valued. I think that's the future of accommodation and inclusion.
Mhm. Absolutely. I'm going to take another audience question here because I think it touches on so much of what we've been talking about, especially with regard to employment in the workplace and these kinds of public settings. What are your experiences and thoughts on addressing structural barriers to accessing diagnosis, treatment, and support? It's a bit of a minefield of a question. So maybe just one or two thoughts each. Andrew, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a really important point. And what my executive director does, Anne Marie McDonald, is she actually talks a lot with different types of workplaces about the importance of sort of talking about the impact on sort of like productivity in kind of workplaces, and making sure that you're providing sort of an open space for your employees to be able to sort of talk about any mental health kind of challenges they might be experiencing. So I think it's kind of really important to sort of continue that discussion with many workplaces, so that we can kind of open up that discussion.
Amanda, what do you think?
Thank you so much for this question. It's a very loaded question. But briefly, for a lot of people, adults, especially autistic adults, formal diagnosis is extremely difficult to receive, in part because of financial barriers. Yet these adults, and I include myself in that number, still need workplace accommodations, but often accommodations you need medical documentation or official diagnosis, which makes it so that in order for us to be the most productive that we are able to be, we all of a sudden are not able to gain those accommodations. And it's the same in post-secondary. So instead of relying so heavily on a medical lens and a medical model of what disability is, I would love to have that conversation of what accommodation be more inclusive, and more understanding of societal barriers such as cost of diagnosis in the future, in the present, because I think it erases some of that stigma that Andrew's mentioned, that Larry has mentioned. of what disability, what disorder is.
Mm-hmm. Larry, what about you?
Yeah, I addressed the answer from two angles, from the diagnosis, the barriers, the time it takes to get to a formal diagnosis, and the difference in the access to treatment, rural versus urban. I think those are barriers to care. I think on the employment accommodation side, the barriers there have got to do with the hiring practices of firms, because some of their advertising for positions immediately exclude those on the neurodiverse spectrum. So I think those are barriers to employment, which should be looked at as well. So those are my 2 points that you asked for.
Thank you very much. We are nearing the end of our talk. It has been so lovely to spend this time with you. Before we go, I wondered if we could just spend a couple minutes talking about what you would like the audience to take away from this conversation. Andrew, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, for sure. I'm really grateful that we had this opportunity to talk about this really important subject. And I'm really hoping that this public talk will help to sort of increase awareness across all of the different brain disorders, so everyone can sort of get the support that they both need and deserve. And finally, I guess I just want to say a sincere and heartwarming thank you to both Amanda's and also Larry, who have definitely sort of given their expertise to ensure all their perspectives are sort of woven into all of the work that we're going to be doing. And they've done it all with so much kind of hope, courage, and kindness. So thanks to all of you for a really great talk.
Hope, courage, and kindness are definitely 3 words that I feel have just woven themselves into all of the discussions that we've been having tonight. And I'm so thankful and grateful to be here sharing this space with all of you. Larry, what would you like the audience to take away from this conversation?
Well, a couple of things. Thank you, Andrew, for those comments. I feel the same. I feel that we start off on our separate journeys, but our whole journey is intertwined. We have similar emotional stresses and strains, but I think what is common is that we try and live the best life that we can. The other point that I'd like to make is that the face of Parkinson's is changing, in the sense that the average age for onset is about 65, but about 10% of people worldwide are diagnosed in their 40s and earlier. And in light of the incidence and prevalence of Parkinson's, this ain't going away anytime soon. So there's a great motivation and commitment to advocacy and to remove the stigma, to ensure that we are valued, that our voices are heard, and that we can all be accommodated. That's the other message. And what you see is not necessarily what you get with Parkinson's. So just be patient and be knowledgeable.
Thank you so much for that. Amanda, what would you like the audience to take away from this conversation? I know it's another loaded question to sort of leave everyone with, but I think there's so much that can come from, just listening to conversations like this, and then also, engaging, like you talked about, on social media and sort of following the community. But over and above that, what is sort of the last thing that you'd like people to hold going forward?
I'm gonna, again, as you said, totally loaded question. But I'm gonna leave you with 2 really quick things. One being, remember that all your advocacy work, all your research, all of your services for children need to be replicated in adulthood. Disabled children become disabled adults. We don't just suddenly grow out of things. We still need the support and the services and the research to continue. And then on a final note, I'm going to end with the most popular slogan of the social model of disability, and that's nothing without us, nothing for us without us. Include us in discussion of brain health, include us in discussions of disability, include us in research, include us in discussion. You can't learn without the experts, and we are the experts.
That is so true. We are the experts indeed. Well, we are coming again to the end of this conversation. Thank you all so much for being here. I just want to take a moment to thank each of you individually, Amanda St. Dennis, Andrew Kcomt, Larry Linton. Thank you so much for being here tonight, for taking part in this discussion. It's been a real pleasure to share space with all of you and your differing viewpoints and the differing journeys that you have had with brain disorders and these journeys that you've all been on. It's something that I, speaking for myself, have learned a lot about, and I'm sure many of our audience can agree. Just before we go, I wanted to say a couple words just to wrap things up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. On behalf of the Ontario Brain Institute, thank you for listening. We have some resources to share with you. We've talked a little bit about them over the course of this discussion today. For more information around this topic and then others as well, relating to brain disorders and how they impact us and so many of those around us, we will post them on screen shortly, and they are also available on the OBI website. Your feedback is extraordinarily valuable to us. We have a survey link in the chat box. Please share with us your thoughts about tonight's talk. OBI Public Talks are designed to share the latest knowledge on brain health and to offer some simple tips to manage both health and wellness. OBI's next set of public talks is called Your Brain Health. This series will explore 4 topics as suggested by you, our audience, via feedback surveys. Stay tuned for talks on youth mental health, dimensions of care, women's brain health, and precision medicine. To sign up for the next talk in April, you can find a link in the chat box or on our website. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful rest of your evening and enjoy the resources that come up.